Hello, my name is Roland Smart. I am the author of a book called The Agile Marketer, and I'm thrilled to be able to share a quick recap of a session that I gave at MarTech 2017 in lovely San Francisco. Agile is a topic that I'm very passionate about. I've been fortunate to be able to apply it to my own work. I would say that I am an advocate for the adoption of Agile in the marketing context. But hopefully, as you'll see from my presentation, I'm also a realist, and my goal is to help you put Agile in context in terms of just to what degree marketers have adopted it. So what I'm going to cover in this presentation is exactly the kinds of things that would influence its adoption. So what are the most common use cases? What are the challenges we're running into? How is it being implemented? And again, where are we on that adoption curve? I'm not going to talk about what Agile marketing is, the values and principles, or what's causing marketers to try it out today. You can check out some of my other presentations for that information. A quick word about my background and why I'm qualified to present on this topic, and hopefully why you'll take some of what I have to offer with a degree of confidence. So besides writing a book called The Agile Marketer, for which I interviewed many marketers about their practice, I also co-host something called the Marketing Agility Podcast with Frank Days. We've brought on many marketers to that show, from big companies, small companies, B2B, B2C, from a range of different ecosystem players, from agencies to technology vendors and so on. So a lot of what I'm going to share in this presentation is based on those conversations. So just a quick caveat up front, a lot of what I'm going to share, because it's based on conversations, it's really anecdotal evidence. I will also share a little bit of survey data, but it's essentially marketers self-reporting about the work that they're doing. And I just want to share a stat from Gartner here that is another example of self-reported data from marketers. We said that by 2016, 89% of companies are going to be competing primarily on the basis of customer experience. Now, I think that anybody listening to this who's a marketer would agree that we're not primarily competing on the basis of customer experience, and it's 2017 now. So the key takeaway that I want you to have here is that I think directionally what we hear marketers report is accurate, but it tends to be over-exuberant. So what I've tried to do is kind of right-size the feedback that I've gotten, both in my book and in this presentation. And a lot of the conversations we have on the podcast are about sort of getting down to brass tacks and figuring out what's actually working today. So let's start just by looking at the use cases that we're hearing. The most common use is just marketing operations, which basically boils down to general project management. Some of the other use cases that come up frequently have to do with content development or content programs, product marketing, advertising, and on down. Interestingly, you'll see the customer experience is all the way down here at the end. Again, just speaking to the fact that it's pretty early days, not just for customer experience, which I think happens to be one of the areas for greatest potential when it comes to the adoption of Agile, but in terms of overall adoption of Agile in the marketing context as well. So I mentioned I was going to share some third-party data. This is some data from a vendor, an Agile tooling vendor called Reich. Their sample set is a little bit different than ours. I'm calling that out on the left-hand graph here. You'll see that they're really looking at, in theory, a broader open set of marketers, whereas everybody that I interviewed for my book and that we bring on the Marketing Agility Podcast, they are using, 100% of them are using Agile to some degree in their marketing practice. So here you can see about 50% have a medium degree of adoption, 15% low, and so on. Now, I think that this is still significantly greater adoption than the larger sort of market of marketers, so to speak. That may be because of how they pulled their sample set. I don't actually have too much background on how they pulled this sample set, but the grain of salt here I would add is just that it seems like it does skew a little more in the direction of greater adoption than is actually the case. In any case, when you look at the use cases that they're showing as their top use cases, they didn't break it out in as granular a manner as I did in the previous graph, but you can see that a lot of the same things are up top: ops, product marketing, PR, comm, social media, and content. So if you're thinking about starting with Agile, that's probably a good place to start. Let's talk about methods. So this is an area where there's just been a tremendous amount of change in the last few years. You've probably heard of the most popular methods, both Kanban and Scrum. Let's start with Scrum for a second, because in many cases, what used to happen is that marketers started with Scrum, and that was because they were accepting influence from their product management peers, who in some cases had already adopted Agile in the context of product management. The thing about Scrum is that it's quite prescriptive, meaning just there's a lot of rules to it, and marketers come from a tradition of psychology, not from a highly structured and rigorous engineering background. And so that level of prescriptiveness was quite hard for marketers to take on. So we saw a lot of marketers basically reject Scrum and retreat to a much less prescriptive method, in this case, Kanban. In some cases, after getting familiar with Kanban and building confidence, they would sort of inch back towards Scrum and land on something called Scrumban. So I mostly advise that marketers who are starting to use Agile in the marketing context start with Kanban and add practices incrementally over time. For this reason, my finding is that Kanban is really increasingly the foundational method for marketers. Here's a little research again from Reich. This research at first glance seems like it may not agree with the finding that I just shared, but I think when we pull this apart, you'll see that it in fact does. So one thing that's a little confusing here is that they combine Lean and Kanban. But in fact, Lean is an approach like Agile, and Kanban is a method. So I think it's fair to combine those two columns. When you do that, what you'll see is that Kanban is clearly the most dominant. Now, Scrumban is interesting because Scrumban is really a mix of Kanban and Scrum, but they have another column that is labeled a mix. So I would argue that you should probably combine Scrumban and that mix column, which would mean that Kanban's first, Scrumban second, Scrum is third. So that gels pretty well with our findings from the podcast. So is Agile replacing traditional methods? Yes and no. It is certainly displacing, I should say, traditional methods insofar as we're spending more time in Agile methods, but it is not replacing them in the sense that Agile always coexists with traditional practices. In many cases, Agile is really a layer that sits on top of a backbone of waterfall. So it's just the takeaway here is to acknowledge that Agile is not a holistic operating system for your marketing function or for the rest of the business for that matter. It's always something that's going to be integrated with traditional practices. And when it comes to people that we talk to on the podcast, we see that the majority of people are spending about 60% of their time in Agile mode and about 40% in waterfall mode. One of our guests on the show, Peter Belante, spoke to the fact that there's some things that just are never going to fit in the context of an Agile method because they don't require iteration. That could be, at one end of the spectrum, things like time dedicated to your expense reports. At the other end of the spectrum, things like very traditional research that may take a quarter to run and that doesn't fit well in the context of your Agile practice. So let's talk a little bit about team structure and how it relates to these methods. So one of the things about Kanban and Scrum is that they have different sort of prescriptions for the way that teams are organized. So Scrum actually prescribes small cross-functional teams, whereas Kanban doesn't really actually make specific prescriptions around team structure. This is one of the reasons why Kanban, I think, has such popularity these days with marketers, because Scrum, to really wholeheartedly embrace Scrum, marketers might have to restructure what are the functional silos within their group for, creative development, design, etc. And that restructuring process, would cause them to blow up their organization to get to a place where they could have a robust Agile implementation. That is very risky, and already adopting Agile can feel risky because where we are in the overall adoption curve of Agile. So this is one of the reasons why Kanban, again, is popular, because it doesn't require that you blow up the functional silos that may exist. And the functional silos, that is the dominant design in most marketing functions today. So we haven't talked to many marketers who have managed a transition from functional silos to small cross-functional teams. It is very, very rare. I believe we've talked to one marketer or two marketers who have made that transition. So when you look at team structure across the people that we've spoken with, about 60% continue to work in functional silos, and they are good candidates for Kanban. They're not always using Kanban, but they are certainly good candidates for it. About 35% have a mix where they've got some cross-functional teams, and there we typically see that they're not actually restructuring their organizations. What they're doing is, when they're setting up new teams, instead of adding them to existing functional silos, they're spinning up small cross-functional teams. And then, as I said, there's a small number of marketers that we've spoken to who have fully build out organizations that are based on cross-functional teams. The majority of those cases are ones that were small cross-functional teams from the get-go, and then a very small percent manage this transition from silos to cross-functional teams. I think the thing to call out here is that small cross-functional teams are absolutely the most effective and productive teams. So getting to small cross-functional teams has a tremendous amount of value, or starting with small cross-functional teams has a tremendous amount of value. But there really isn't a dominant pattern yet that is emerging when it comes to how marketers who are in larger organizations with silos are going to make a transition, if they are going to make that transition. It may be that they will forego the most productive team structure to be able to maintain their functional silos via an implementation of Kanban, so that they still get some of the benefits of Agile without having to blow up their organization. So looking at how Agile comes into the organization, the dominant pattern that we see right now is that mid-level managers are bringing Agile into a functional silo, and in some cases they are getting silos that are adjacent to the one that they manage to flip over to Agile as well. So this is what I sometimes refer as horizontal scale, getting those adjacent functional silos to flip to Agile as well. If you have a lot of connections points to them, it's easy to do that. It is quite hard, though, to really spread broadly across an organization when it's being driven by mid-level managers. What is even harder than that, though, is for these mid-level managers to get their managers to actively buy into the process and to participate in the process on a regular basis. And you can see that reality playing out in the enterprise when it comes to Agile adoption. So the vast majority of cases, 80% of cases, are ones in which we have these mid-level managers who are trying to use it in their own area, but also drive it into the company more broadly. And there we see a relatively low degree of success. So less than 20% of the time are they in fact getting that broader adoption. More often than not, we see mid-level managers in that scenario leave the company, and when they do that, their teams fall back on the traditional practices that they were using before. At the other end of the spectrum, we see a very small number of companies that have a forward thinking CEO or CMO who is willing to invest in what it takes to set their teams up for success with Agile. So that can be management consulting and training and certification and some of those Agile methods that I mentioned earlier. And when they do make those investments, we see a much greater degree of success, about 50% or greater. And then finally, the best success, of course, is when we have both the top-down and the bottom-up support for Agile, investment in Agile. And there we see greater transition rates, greater than 70%. Now, this is the enterprise use case. Smaller companies, of course, you would expect to see better results. But in either case, the takeaway here is that executive buy-in is really the single biggest indicator of success of an Agile transformation. You absolutely need to have that executive buy-in. And now, that is, I should say, qualify that by saying this is where we are in the adoption curve of Agile right now. This may change in the future, but for now, this is absolutely the case. So what's working with executives? What's actually getting them to buy in? So I think one of the most effective things that we are hearing is that it's the role that management consulting has to play with respect to executive education and getting them to buy in. Typically, this would be combined with a sanctioned pilot of some sort that has a commitment from the executive sponsor that are correlated to some kind of demonstrable result. So this is different than the kind of pilot that I was talking about before, where mid-level managers are sort of using it within their own groups. I'm talking here about something more structured where it is a pilot where if they meet certain goals or benchmarks, further investment will be made in driving a broader transformation. So the good news, though, is that we are seeing meaningful steps when it comes to the development of an ecosystem, which is really facilitating or making it easier for marketing organizations to make their way through this Agile transformation. So you can see this playing out in the management consulting world. The biggest firms are starting to build out Agile transformation practices. There's an ecosystem of training and certification providers that have typically been focused on engineering or product management, but who are now offering training for business teams and including marketers. One area where there's just a tremendous amount of investment and innovation taking place is in the tooling space. There are just many, many new business-oriented tools coming to market to help marketers manage their day-to-day Agile practice. There's conferences like MarTech and many others that are starting to launch either Agile tracks or that are focused on Agile in the marketing context. And then, of course, there's great books coming to market. Some have been, I obviously wrote one. There's one that was written by the founder of the MarTech conference, a guy named Scott Brinker, and many others that are worth checking out if you want to learn more. On the side of the slide here, I'm just showing some Google Trends data, which speaks to the fact that Agile marketing is gaining traction in the market as search volume has been steadily increasing over the last 10 years. One question that I get a lot is Agile and Lean, are Agile and Lean competing for mind share? And this Google Trends data just shows that Agile and Lean have been steadily gaining prevalence within the marketing context. Agile seems to be eking out a lead over the last year or so, and might be on path to becoming the dominant term. But the reality is it doesn't really matter at the end of the day which term becomes more prevalent. I think it's the underlying principles and values underneath these approaches that are making their way into the market, and both Agile and Lean have a role to play in doing that. I think it's also just worth calling out that there is a real convergence taking place between Agile and Lean. If you looked at the Venn diagram of these different approaches, one comes out of the software world, one comes out of the manufacturing world. That's Lean. There's probably about 80% overlap between these approaches, and they are both helping drive the sort of core values and principles associated with Agile into the marketer's world. Just putting Agile marketing in context of some other trends or movements that have come into the marketer's world, you can see when you compare it to something like inbound marketing, it's still very, very early days, right? It's just still getting off the blocks. So this speaks to the fact that Agile marketing is something that we hope will see significant growth, because we know the potential that it has to help marketers in their work and help them establish more credibility and step up to serve as the steward of customer experience over the long run, but we have a long way to go. In the parlance of crossing the chasm, right, we're still very focused on early adopters who are driving innovation. We're just coming up on the pragmatist's radar. This is, again, why management consulting firms have such a critical role to play today in educating executives about Agile and why it has a benefit to offer. One last stat that I'll share, a graph that I'll share from the Reich research. You can see when they surveyed people about how long they'd been using Agile, the majority of people started using Agile within just the last 6 months. Again, that just speaks to where we are in the overall adoption curve. So I'll leave you with a little cheat sheet for those of you who are inspired to explore Agile in your organization, or for those of you who are already using Agile and wanted to understand where you are in the adoption curve. I hope this is something you can take back to your teams and will find useful. So executive buy-in, make sure that you're enlisting an executive sponsor and getting commitments from them in exchange for your pilot. Set expectations that it's going to take 3 to 6 months to stabilize on your Agile method. You're going to need to tailor it to your team over time and iterate on the method itself. Get training and certification when possible for your teams. Leverage management consulting to get management actually actively involved and to help change their mindset in ways that will facilitate an Agile transformation. Don't try to reorg, at least not at first. If you have cross-functional teams, stick with that. That's the best path forward. But if you do have functional teams, consider using Kanban with those functional teams, and don't try and change that structure. In general, I would say start with Kanban. There are some exceptions where Scrum or Scrumban might be a better fit, but if you're looking for a general purpose method, start with Kanban. Make sure that you are using retrospectives to iterate on the process itself and tailor it to your organization over time. And then finally, pick a tool to help manage your day-to-day practice. There are many great tools on the market, from Asana, LeanKit, Trello, and others. So with that, thanks so much for listening. I hope this was helpful when it comes to putting Agile in the marketing context in perspective. If you want to learn more and hear directly from marketers who are using Agile, tune in to the Marketing Agility podcast. You can find us on iTunes. Thanks.